if you're fortunate enough in life, you've got a mother or a father or a sister or a brother or a colleague or a friend, somebody who picks you up and pushes you forward when you're down. And Theodore Roosevelt was no different. You know, we've had this myth of the self-made man in our imagination for basically 100 plus years. And I don't think it diminishes Theodore Roosevelt at all to know that he too needed help and to hear about the people who helped him and propelled him to his success. So I'd say just that kind of revelation was the biggest discovery for me, because it wasn't the story that I read about growing up. It wasn't the story that I was told about Theodore Roosevelt.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors, Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University, and GBH Forum Network. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs at American Ancestors, the creator and producer of this book talk series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of history, looking at both presidential history and women's history. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book, The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt by Edward F. O'Keefe. Now, for some background on tonight's author, welcome Susan Spurlock of Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. Edward F. O'Keefe is the CEO of the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library Foundation. He previously spent 2 decades in broadcast and digital media at ABC News, CNN, and now this, during which time he received a Primetime Emmy Award for his work with Anthony Bourdain, 2 Webby Awards, the Edward R. Murrow Award, and a George Foster Peabody Award for ABC's coverage of 9/11. A former fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, he graduated with honors from Georgetown University. He was born in North Dakota and lives in New York. Now back to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Susan. I am delighted to be welcoming back Debby Applegate as our moderator, who she has been before in the series, joined us before. Ms. Applegate is an historian and biographer based in New Haven, Connecticut. Her first book was The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher, winner of the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for Biography. It was also a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for Biography. Her second book, Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age, was named a New York Times Editor's Choice Best Book of 2021 and won an Earphones Award for Best Audiobook. We will hear from Ms. Applegate in the second half of our program, but for now, for the main event, welcome, Mr. O'Keefe. Thank you for joining us from North Dakota with this truly wonderful book. As we were talking about in the green room a moment ago, we all know so many things about TR, but there is so much more to learn always. Of course, his first wife, born Alice Hathaway Lee, was a Bostonian. So the many of you on from Massachusetts, a fact to know. What I haven't mentioned to you before, though, Ed, is that they were married just around the corner from here. At the Unitarian Universalist Church just up the hill. I think of them, the wonderful couple, and her family, the Lees, often. So we are all eager to gain your insight on these wonderful Roosevelt women. So Ed, over to you.
Well, it is wonderful to be with you all this evening. I noted on the RSVP list that we have attendees from all 50 states and several different countries, which is remarkable. As Margaret mentioned, I am joining you tonight from North Dakota, even though I reside in New York City. I wrote The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt to investigate a story that has largely been lost in history. These remarkable women that I'm going to talk with you about tonight. The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt argues that the most masculine president in the American memory was actually the product of extraordinary and unsung women. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And for about 25 minutes, as Margaret mentioned, tell you about this remarkable family, the Roosevelt family. I've spent the last 5 years of my life with these individuals. Martha Bullock Roosevelt, the matriarch of the Roosevelt family. Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who was known popularly as Thee by his friends and family, and their four children, Anna Roosevelt Cowles, Theodore Roosevelt, of course, the most famous amongst them, Elliott Roosevelt, who was the father of Eleanor Roosevelt, and Corrine Roosevelt Robinson. This remarkable family produced some of the most influential people in the 20th century. And I want to tell you a bit more about Mom. Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt was TR's mother and Eleanor's grandmother. She was actually the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. That's something that Margaret Mitchell reported in the 1920s. She was known for her witty, sharp-tongued turns of phrase, these coy statements. I mean, she's the one who introduced her precocious son to the McGuffey readers, and the McGuffey readers had all of these interesting phrases, such as the African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." She lost contact with her two brothers during the Civil War, and actually, her mother and her aunt, her sister, both moved from Georgia and moved in with the Roosevelt family at 28 East 20th Street in New York City. So Theodore Roosevelt, as a young child, his father mostly away, which we'll talk about in a moment, he's growing up with a retinue of remarkable women in his midst, in addition to the housemaids and servants that populate 28 East 20th Street. He's being raised not only by his mother, but his grandmother and his aunt, who all live with the Roosevelt family. Mitty has 4 children in 6 years, and she's widowed quite young. Her husband, Thee, which we'll talk about in a moment, actually dies at age 46, rather young for the time. And she has this remarkable phrase that she passes on to her children. She says, "You need to live for the living and not for the dead. If you do not live a life of purpose, you dishonor your father." And so if you think about the two things we really know about Theodore Roosevelt, is this empathy, this incredible gregarious personality, and his ability to will through physical and, on occasion, emotional pain. Those are two traits that he largely gets from his mother. And she's the diametric opposite of Thee, whom we're going to hear about in just a moment. Thee, her brother-in-law actually says, between your liveliness and his solemnity, you make an even pair. It's the old phrase, opposites attract. TR's childhood is really interesting because he's an asthmatic, sickly child. He is interested in taxidermy and natural science. He lives a life in books and in the mind. His mother notices very young that he's odd. He needs playmates and friends. So he actually reaches out to a neighborhood child, this little girl in the middle of the frame, Edie Carew. She lives nearby in the same neighborhood as the Roosevelts, and she grows up from 3 years old to Theodore Roosevelt's death at 60 with TR. So they knew each other for 57 years of his life. She's the bonus sister. She's good friends with his younger sister, Connie, and everyone throughout their entire life believes that they will be married. They have a budding romance throughout their childhood. There's also this famous moment in Theodore Roosevelt's young life, his adolescence, where his father tells him at around the age of 12 or 13 years old, "You have the mind, but you must make your body. If you don't make your body, the mind cannot go as far as it can." What's also kind of interesting about this moment in TR's life is it marks a kind of break with his mother. From his early existence, his mother had been the one to massage the blood literally out of his body by massaging his chest. She had taken him to salons. I mean, the beginning of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, the very first line is, "From the beginning, the survival of Theodore Roosevelt was very much in doubt." His mother believed that he would not live past 4 or 5 years old. And so this moment where his father extols him to make his body has been written in history as a turning point, and it certainly is. And his father is a remarkable man, but his early death really takes Thee to a new level of honor in his memory and in the history that has been written. But it's his mother, Mitty, who largely takes care of him and makes sure that he survives to that adolescence. Theodore Roosevelt Sr., Thee, as I mentioned, is a deservedly remarkable man. He's Theodore Roosevelt's father and Eleanor's grandfather. He's a stern disciplinarian. As lively as Mitty is, Thee is the opposite. He's a devout Christian, and not just any type of Christian. He's devoted to muscular Christianity, this belief at this time in the 1860s and the 1870s, where actually the depictions of Jesus become much beefier and more robust. The industrial industries are changing. The agrarian society is becoming such that to show your works and worth, you do philanthropic acts, particularly if you are one of the wealthier citizens. And so he believes in this Christian precept that to whom much is given, much is required. He's a partner at Roosevelt and Sons, but he doesn't work there very often. His focus is really on philanthropy. He's one of the co-founders of the American Museum of Natural History. He's one of the co-founders of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He founds the first orthopedic hospital in the city of New York and thus the nation. And he's very involved with the Newsboys Orphanage. He does not participate in the Civil War as a soldier. His wife, Mitty, a devoted Southerner, believes that if he goes to battle, he might inevitably face her brothers, and she restricts him. She forbids him really from taking up arms in the Civil War. So he hired a substitute, and he works very closely with President Lincoln, which we're going to hear more about in a moment. And I've also mentioned earlier that he has an unexpected death that just absolutely stunned his son, Theodore Roosevelt, who adored him. So one of the new discoveries I made in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is this letter from December 31st, 1861, which is, of course, the first year of the Civil War. It's one of 11 letters that were locked in a safe at Sagamore Hill since 1954. And the president of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, Greg Wynn, opened that safe and revealed these letters for the first time. I was able to write about them in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and this is from Thee to a 3-year-old Teedy. So he can't yet read or write, and as you can see, the stationery features a depiction of Andrew Jackson's statue, which sits outside the White House in Lafayette Square to this day. Harvard called the discovery of these 11 letters one of the most important sets of TR's correspondence to surface since his death in 1919. And here's one reason why. In this particular letter, Thee writes, "I have just come from the president's house, the president who governs our whole country. And there is a statue outside his house with a saying on the statue. I want for your mother to read it to you so that you can learn it by heart and repeat it to me when I get home. And the statue says, the Federal Union, it must be preserved." An absolutely extraordinary letter. When you think about Thee meeting with President Lincoln, coming out of the White House during the height of the Civil War and writing to his 3-year-old son, the future president of the United States, and instilling in him that value of preserving the Federal Union. And of also, of course, a little bit of a dig at his Southern wife, of course, because his son can't read and she'll have to read it to him. So I want to fast forward a little bit to a consequential year in Theodore Roosevelt's life, 1878. So he's just started Harvard in 1876. He's returning for his second year. And in February of 1878, Thee dies of stomach cancer. He had been sick, and when Theodore Roosevelt was home, he thought that he wasn't doing well, but that he wouldn't necessarily die. He didn't make it home in time for the death of his father, something that he later blamed his brother Elliot for. And then just a few months later, on August 22nd, 1878, so just a few months after the death of his father, he and his intended betrothed, Edie, were walking in Oyster Bay. They went up to Tranquility, which when the Roosevelts were there was anything but tranquil. And she had just celebrated her 17th birthday, making her eligible to be wed. Everyone again, they go pick water lilies. They go on a boat ride in Oyster Bay. But something happened on August 22nd, 1878, an explosive breakup. We don't know why. It has been lost to history. Theodore Roosevelt will only speak of it one more time in his life in a letter to his older sister, Bammy, in which he says, "I suppose we have and had tempers far from being the best." And Edith will later tell one of her children that Theodore had proposed and she had rejected him. But we don't know. We need the Netflix series of the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt so we can speculate on what happened on August 22nd, 1878. Nevertheless, in the course of just a few months, he lost his beloved father and he lost the woman he intended or thought that he was going to marry. And then in October, just 2 months later, he meets Alice Hathaway Lee. Alice Hathaway Lee is a beautiful, beguiling, the most eligible Boston Brahmin in bachelorette in all of the Northeast. She's been written off in history as a Victorian, typical of the age, non-consequential, inconsequential in Theodore Roosevelt's life. That is simply not true. There are 24 letters between Alice and Theodore, love letters and detailed political conversations that were not available to previous biographers. They were not available to Edmund Morris during his writing of the Pulitzer Prize-winning The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. They were not available to David McCullough when he wrote Mornings on Horseback. These letters are explored in depth for the first time in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, and they really show an engaged, dynamic, interesting, compelling, intelligent Alice Hathaway Lee. I think of her as a gamine, curious, playful, intelligent, sexy Audrey or Kate Hepburn. And of course, for those who are joining us from Massachusetts, know she comes from the Cabot-Lee progressive line. And it's that old Boston toast. And this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells talk only to the Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God. She is a Cabot. And you have to remember at this time in Theodore Roosevelt's life, he's a geeky naturalist in whose wake formaldehyde lingers. He's got specimens in various stages of decay in his pockets. The idea that Theodore Roosevelt would get the most eligible bachelorette in all of Boston is absurd. But it was Alice who steered Theodore away from natural science and toward politics. With Alice at his side, his 1880 college senior thesis was about suffrage. He endorsed equality between men and women. He said women should be doctors, lawyers, and judges, that they should own property, and that they should not necessarily take their husband's name upon marriage. So again, you just put together the pieces of the puzzle. He lost his father, he lost his girlfriend, and now he's met Alice, and he's the Lees and the Saltonstalls, this progressive-minded family of two families together in one property in Chestnut Hill, really become a substitute family for Theodore Roosevelt at a difficult time in his life. So compelling, so beguiling was Alice that her nickname was Sunshine. So in the 1870s, if you wanted to show that you were dating, wanted to have the proof to the public, you would get a tintype. And there's letter after letter of Theodore Roosevelt begging Alice to go get a tintype with him. Finally, he accomplishes his mission, and you see the results here on screen. She brings her cousin. Here you have Rose Saltonstall sitting between Alice and Theodore. And as you can see, Theodore is not exactly happy about it, but he's persistent. He's Theodore Roosevelt. He gets a second tintype. And in this one, Rose is standing and Theodore is seated next to Alice. You can see his arm, his hand is ever so close to her elbow, the first evidence that he's winning his battle to win her heart. But it was not a battle that he undertook alone. He really needed the Roosevelt women in his life. This is a photo of Alice on the left, Connie in the middle, and Bammy seated. He needed his sisters and his mother, who came to Chestnut Hill, and then the Lees came to New York City, and they really helped Theodore win Alice's heart. I think, and I contend in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, that Alice fell in love with the women in his life and the idea of becoming a part of this miraculous family as much as he did Theodore himself. I want to touch upon just for a moment, because I know we have viewers from all over the nation, on Theodore's first experience in North Dakota, which was September 20th, 1880, just before he marries Alice Hathaway Lee on October 27th, 1880. And it was during that trip that he came very near present-day Fargo and remarks, "I had a lovely night. I had to sleep on the floor under a buffalo robe, the wind howling round the frail little house, the neat but frail little house." So there's his first exposure to the Dakota Badlands, which will become so essential after the devastating loss of Alice. They had a very passionate relationship. I explore in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, again, these 24 letters that have not been available to other historians and have not been the focus of any work. Here on October 3rd, 1880, Theodore writes to Alice, "It will be the last separation from my darling. For 3 weeks from Wednesday we are married. It makes me so happy I am almost afraid." And Alice, writing to Theodore on October 6, 1880, "My own dearest Teddy," and incidentally, she's one of the only ones in addition to his family that ever called him Teddy. And after she died, he never liked that nickname again, even though he knew, of course, it popularized him. "My own dearest Teddy, I just long to be with you all the time and never separate from you, even for 3 weeks. Teddykins, I know you can make me happy, and you must never think it would never have been better for me if we had never met. I should die without you now, Teddy, and there is not another man I could ever have loved in this world." Of course, it will turn out to be the opposite. On February 14th, 1884, Theodore Roosevelt lost not only Alice, but his mother, Mittie, on the same day in the same house, a devastating Valentine's Day. He had rushed home from Albany, and his brother had said, "There is a curse on this house. Mother is dying, and Alice is dying too." At 2:30 in the morning, the family gathered around Mittie on the second floor when she died of typhoid fever. He rushed back up to the third floor, and Theodore held Alice in his arms for 11 hours until at 1:30 in the afternoon of that infamous day, Alice died of Bright's disease, a complication of childbirth, the birth that she had given just 2 days earlier. He wrote an X in his diary, "The light has gone out of my life." And remember her nickname, Sunshine. It was the sunshine of Alice that had gone from his life. Another new discovery I want to talk about briefly in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. It's written in many of the biographies of Theodore Roosevelt that after the death of Alice, he expunged her from his memory and never spoke of her again. That is simply not true. Of course, he had the living embodiment of his first marriage with Alice in the form of his daughter, whom they also named Alice. But there's also this remarkable artifact. When I was researching at Sagamore Hill, I said, I want to see any evidence of Alice. She died at 22 and seems to have disappeared off the face of the earth. And we found this entry that said, Alice hair, 9 months. And I said, look, I know it's a stretch, but I want to see it because there just isn't much of her around. Well, we opened this teal blue colored box, almost looks like a Tiffany box. And there at the top level was indeed Alice's hair at 9 months. But as we opened the second layer, there was this extraordinary discovery. In the unmistakable handwriting of Theodore Roosevelt, the hair of my sweet wife, Alice, cut after death, 16 inches of Alice's hair and several photos of her that he kept hidden for decades at Sagamore Hill and is revealed for the first time in this work. So how did he care for this daughter that he had been left with after the death of his wife? He left her in the care of Bammy, his older sister and political confidant. Bammy is the atlas on whom the world turned, in Theodore's words. She was his older sister and key political strategist. I say that she was like what Robert F. Kennedy was to John F. Kennedy. In fact, it was Theodore Roosevelt's own daughter that said, I always believed that if Bammy had been a man, she, rather than my father, would have been president. An extraordinary statement that indeed Eleanor Roosevelt agreed with. She suffered a spinal defect and taught TR resilience through pain. That's why Thee formed that orthopedic hospital. So again, he's learning that wit through his mother, that resilience through pain through his mother, and seeing an example in his older sister of willing through physical pain. Her home in Washington, D.C. at 1733 N Street was known as the Little White House. It's where the first meetings of the Roosevelt cabinet were held. She did not marry until her 40s and did not have her first and only child, until the age of 42, dedicating almost her entire adult life to her brother's political success. And I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt who put it best, that if you wanted advice, you went to Bammy, but if you wanted sympathy, you went to Connie. Connie was Theodore Roosevelt's younger sister and an equal political confidant. She was a poet and accomplished author. She was his emotional outlet and source of empathy or sympathy. They remarkably took advantage of the misogyny of the era. It was during Theodore Roosevelt's governorship of New York that Connie would host these breakfasts, and Boss Platt would come over and inevitably say, "All right, now everyone clear out. I want my time with the governor." And Theodore would say, "Well, certainly my sister can stay. I mean, she's only but a woman to be in the room." And Boss Platt would let Connie stay. She would knit in the corner and hear every word that Boss Platt and Theodore exchanged. When the boss left, she would confide with him. And so important were these conversations that after his governorship, he said to his sister, haven't we had fun being governor of New York? So one sister could have been the president were she a man, and the other sister was so important to TR's success that she was basically his co-governor. She was also his press secretary before the role existed, and an extraordinary kind of source of the humanizing of TR. She knew that if the public fell in love with the Roosevelt family, he would have more ease in his policy and political success. Which brings us back, of course, to Edie. Edie comes back into Theodore's life after the death of Alice. He goes to the Badlands of North Dakota and lives for the better part of 2 years as a rancher and a cowboy. And he says to his sister, I don't want to see when I come back from the Badlands, I do not want to see Edie. She's always been outside of the inner circle, the bonus sister. But now, of course, he comes back to New York and he encounters Edie again, and suddenly they fall madly back in love. They're secretly engaged, and she is the exact opposite of Alice. You couldn't really find two more different women than Alice and Edie, and Theodore married both within the space of 6 years. It was said of Edith Carow Roosevelt that Mrs. Roosevelt is more difficult of access. Praise does not reach or define her. She was also known as her husband's political alter ego and emotional rudder. She could soothe that tempestuous nature and bring him back from his emotional outbursts. She burned much of the correspondence between she and Theodore, but we have firsthand observations of just how influential she was in the life of her husband. She also lived for 30 years beyond the death of TR. She has this wonderful phrase about raising children being her beloved shackles. And she said of her grandchildren, I like to see their little faces, but I prefer to see their backs. An interesting and kind of dynamic woman. And that brings up this moment of conversation around the relationship between the Roosevelt women. You know, Bammy and Alice, Connie and Edie all knew one another during their lives. And then, of course, when Alice dies, I mean, Alice is the one who will say when Theodore comes home, Teddy is home, come and share him. But Edie is the one who will say, you know, I think, Theodore, we've seen enough of Bammy and Connie for the summer season. It's a very big dynamic change in how the sisters and his wives interrelate and really jockey for power and influence during not only his life, but of course his presidency. And I can't get through a talk about the Roosevelt family without quickly noting Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Of course, she's the first born in 1884 and the last to die in 1980, 96 years old. She knew every president from her father to Gerald Ford. She's known as the second Washington Monument. And of course, Theodore famously said, I can either run the country or I can control Alice, but I cannot possibly do both. And she gave as good as she got. It was Alice who said of her father that he wants to be the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, and the baby at every christening. She had that pillow at her home in Washington that said, if you haven't got anything good to say, Come and sit by me. And she was the source of those 24 love letters donated to Harvard in 1986 that really give us a much fuller view of her mother, Alice Hathaway Lee. And she said, interestingly, that she felt that Edith never really forgave Theodore for his first marriage, that there were three people in his father's marriage to Edith, that it was Edith, Theodore, and the ghost of her 22-year-old mother ever present in their relationship. I want to pivot for just one last moment. I'm here in North Dakota before we go to the wonderful conversation and your questions with Debbie, and tell you a little bit about the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library we're building here in Medora, North Dakota. Medora is, of course, where Theodore Roosevelt came for those better part of 2 years during his mourning and depression, and then he returned here multiple times throughout the course of his life. We're building a wonderful, spectacular museum. We've raised $321 million and are currently under construction. The design is by Snohetta, who designed the 9/11 Museum in New York and the and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art out in California. You can see an aerial rendering of the facility. We're scheduled to open on July 4th, 2026, the 250th anniversary of America. And it's going to be a very different kind of museum. There will be a narrative gallery where there are artifacts and the chronological story of Theodore Roosevelt, but there'll also be these immersive experiences where we really want to engage children. You're looking at a rendering of the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. This is Roosevelt's imagination come alive, where we want children to be able to interact and play, to open a book and have an extinct species of bird flutter out and join a world of wonder. Or perhaps gather around the campfire of the Elkhorn, recreated, and hear the stories of the cowboys and the ranchers that worked alongside Theodore during his time in the Dakotas. You can see here one last image of the Presidential Library, again, under construction now. The only presidential library you'll be able to hike, bike, or ride a horse to, coming in 2026. But with that, I want to end with this beautiful image of this remarkable family that I've been spending a lot of time with over the past 5 years, and hope to talk with all of you and Debbie about your questions and the loves of Theodore Roosevelt. Thank you.
Oh, Ed, that was so wonderful. I'm sad that we have to stop listening to you, except we have dozens and dozens of questions. I personally have at least a dozen questions. I was going to start with a big question, but I have to start with to me, the big teaser. Why were those letters left in there for 50 years? What happened? Why now? Why did we get to open now?
Well, I mean, Debbie, in your work, it's extraordinary that history tends to reveal itself at its own pace, and you just never know what part of the story has been left behind or left out. And I think it goes to show that even in the case of someone as famous as Theodore Roosevelt, there's more left to discover. Those letters in particular were the result of a little bit of a disagreement between the Theodore Roosevelt Association and the National Park Service. The Theodore Roosevelt Association and your good friend John Gable John didn't run it as Sagamore Hill, but he ran the Theodore Roosevelt Association. Originally, Sagamore Hill was run by the TRA, and then it became a National Historic Site. So several items were in contention for many years about whether they were park property or whether they were the property of the Theodore Roosevelt Association. And they finally resolved that in 2019, and these letters surfaced for the first time.
How did they resolve it?
Well, they basically determined that they were the property of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, and so the association felt that they would be best suited to join the collection at Harvard, which is where I first encountered them. And so now these 11 letters are a part of the Theodore Roosevelt collection at the Houghton Library at Harvard University.
Harvard will scoop up anything within its site if you let them. That is extraordinary, and that alone. And so I guess maybe I will move to a question from that follows up on that from one of our audience members. What was your favorite discovery? I mean, obviously, you must have been thrilled at a million different ways at not just the new material, but putting the pieces together in ways that gave you brand new insights that we never had before. Was there anything that really stood out that you just loved so much?
Well, I mean, I originally set out to write about Theodore Roosevelt's time in the Badlands. I grew up in North Dakota, and hearing the legend of Theodore Roosevelt, I felt like that story meant a lot to me personally. I think that it's something that tells you that you need to pick yourself up when you're down and push yourself forward at moments of emotional challenge. But as I researched, I kept finding these letters and these extraordinary conversations between Bammy and Connie and Mitty and Thea and Edith and Alice. And I thought, I was a journalist for 20 years, so my journalistic instinct kicked in. I said, well, this is the story. I mean, these have always been periphery characters with the central character of Theodore Roosevelt, but it made me think of, if you're fortunate enough in life, you've got a mother or a father or a sister or a brother or a colleague or a friend, somebody who picks you up and pushes you forward when you're down. And Theodore Roosevelt was no different. We've had this myth of the self-made man in our imagination for basically 100+ years. And I don't think it diminishes Theodore Roosevelt at all to know that he too needed help, and to hear about the people who helped him and propelled him to his success. So I'd say just that kind of revelation was the biggest discovery for me, because it wasn't the story that I read about growing up. It wasn't the story that I was told about Theodore Roosevelt.
Well, and I guess that was my first big question. The whole book. I'm sorry, I got it right here. I'm going to keep gesturing. Well, you can't see the beautiful cover, but it's great. There we go. It's a super fun book. They're really great pictures. It's just a charming, fun book to read. We know so much, those Roosevelts. We know so much about his cousin FDR, and who also was a man of great charisma and verve. But we know so much about Eleanor, and we know about his mother, his very strong influence of his mother, Sarah Delano Roosevelt. But really, this is not part of the story. I can say this, that I fell in love with Theodore Roosevelt reading Herman Hagedorn's old book, The Boy's Life of Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, you don't have to be a boy to love it. It was just, and that was, of course, part of the charm. Now I can see why it could be the boy's life. And it didn't matter to me. He was just a great character. Why don't we know more about them? Why, especially in contrast to the FDR, where we do know more?
Well, I write in the book and in the acknowledgments in particular that I stand on the shoulders of historians and writers that have gone before me. Herman Hagedorn, you mentioned, of course, Edmund Morris and David McCullough, I mentioned earlier. Dr. Kathleen Dalton, who for my money wrote the best single-volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt ever, A Strenuous Life, which came out in 2001. Betty Caroli, who's written a wonderful compendium of vignettes about the women in the Roosevelt family on both the FDR and the TR side. And Dr. Stacy Cordery, who's written a single-volume biography of Alice Roosevelt Longworth. And, I've had conversations with each of them, because to tell you the truth, Debbie, I mean, as a man writing about the women in Theodore Roosevelt's life, I felt, is this really my business to do this? Am I appropriating a story? And without hesitation, they said, no, we have to have these stories told, because, we're not like the United Kingdom, where there are stories of queens, Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth, and powerful women in history. Of course, there have been powerful women in the history of our country, but they're not the central characters. I mean, you just said it, Debbie. We know a lot about Eleanor and FDR. We haven't really heard the names Bammy and Connie. We only really know about Theodore, right? He's on Mount Rushmore. He's literally made of stone in our memory, a caricature or a cartoon if you watch a Night at the Museum, but he's flesh and blood. And he's made flesh and blood by these extraordinary women in his life. And you mentioned Sarah Roosevelt, the FDR's mother. I think there's a remarkable contrast, and this really comes out in the work of Kathy and Stacy and Betty, who sort of see, Betty in particular had this wonderful theory that I talk about in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, that Mitty really understood that in order for her daughters, Bammy and Connie, to succeed, she herself needed to reseed from the family competition. That she had this intuitive understanding that to be a beautiful, witty Southern woman. I mean, the inspiration for Scarlett O'Hara, which is not entirely a compliment, but certainly a compelling personality.
That is new. I cannot believe I never
Well,
knew, never
she
heard
could
that.
overshadow them. You know, she
Yeah.
could just swamp them, and they would never have any confidence of their own. But she didn't do that. She let them shine in their own way. And history then said she's inconsequential, right? She had nothing to do with his success. But maybe Mitty meant it that way. Maybe she did not want to detract from the power of her beautiful and compelling and intelligent daughters.
I can't help it. You talk a lot about the relationship, the sort of rivalry with Edith and Alice, even though Alice is gone and Edith won the big prize. And it's really quite compelling, I think. I can't help it. I kind of blame Edith to some extent because she's a letter burner who the great enemy of all historians. I mean, it sounds like she burned hundreds of letters. Is that correct? And surely many of those letters would have pointed to, as you point out, the extraordinary influence of Alice in inspiring his move to politics and in motivating him to just have bigger horizons. And also, I don't know, you don't dwell on the idea that she might have been competitive with his sisters who she was so close to, but surely they didn't get a star billing either. And she herself seems to have taken a very Victorian attitude towards self-presentation.
Well, absolutely. I think, I take issue with and had conversations with before his untimely passing, Edmund Morris's description, for instance, of Alice, who really kind of cruelly writes in a remarkable book, a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, that the greatest service she ever gave TR was to die, basically. I mean, it's pretty harsh. And, I have
Edmund
to
Morris was a bit of a tough character.
But I have to step back and say, well, now hold on a second. So, they know each other for a total of 6 years. They're married for 4. And in those years, Theodore Roosevelt wins his first elected office. He is the youngest New York State assemblyman in history to this day. He writes his first major book, The Naval War of 1812, and he enters law school. Doesn't complete it, but he enters law school, and that fuels in part his passion for politics, because he figures, well, why should I be a lawyer or a judge when I can go make the laws as a politician? So he, in his own words, in those years with Alice, rose like a rocket. When Alice dies, Theodore Roosevelt does not hold elected office for 15 years. I mean, he's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's a Civil Service Commissioner. He's a police commissioner. I'm not suggesting he didn't have politically, civically engaged jobs during that time. But Edith doesn't necessarily want him to be a politician. She doesn't want to share him with the world. Alice has a very different kind of outlook coming from that Lee, Cabot, Saltonstall, progressive Boston Brahmin perspective. So I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that had Alice lived, as Edith somewhat cruelly said, that she would have bored him to death. I mean, that's how she described it. I think he could have easily gone on to many other great things with her.
Did Alice Longworth, did she get along with her stepmother? She is probably the only one we do remember of the females of that family.
Yes. I mean, a fascinating dynamic. It's a pretty tough relationship as Alice is growing up with the Roosevelts. I mean, Edith, in the ledgers at Sagamore Hill, Edith keeps meticulous track of every dime that the family spends, but there's no record for Alice. It just simply says next to the ledger, Lee money. So Alice would go spend every summer with the Lees in Boston, and the Lees would provide for her. And I think there was a little bit of resentment. I mean, the Roosevelts are always trying to figure out how they're going to make any money. They constantly think about selling Sagamore Hill. So I think there was a little financial resentment of her independence as well. Edith says perhaps her most cruel statement on Alice's wedding day. She gets married in the White House and exhausted at the end of the day. Edith says to Alice, "You've never been anything but trouble," and says, "I'm glad you're leaving." And Alice kind of dismisses it, says, "Oh, mother, you don't really mean that." And Edith did insist, by the way, that she call her mother. And the relationship softens in the later years after TR's death. They get a little closer, and in the oral interviews in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, Alice's memory of Edith becomes a little softer, a little better. But nonetheless, she maintains that this was a complicated dynamic. That Ted Jr. Is the one who tells Alice that it is Edith who says, had Alice lived, had the wife lived, she would have bored Theodore to death. That they say very cruel things to each other. So a very complicated relationship.
And I want to go to some of these other questions because they're such good ones, but I just have to ask one last thing. What happens to Elliot? Why is he not fully part of this whole package of activity and fun and all the things that go along with? That's what I loved, in the point where he has to convince Alice everyone has to be really fun, so Alice is convinced to marry him. How unusual. But what happens to Elliot?
Well, Elliot is a tragedy of his own making. He was probably he was probably undiagnosed, in self-medicated with drugs and alcohol. He died at age 34. At that point, that left Eleanor orphaned and her brother orphaned. At age 10, Theodore had a very competitive relationship with Elliot. They were constantly sort of comparing one another. And Theodore is seen as the not very fun, serious brother, and Elliot's the good time in their kind of youth and adolescence. And then, of course, that spirals out of control in his 20s and 30s. It's a fascinating dynamic. I talk about the dynamic between the brothers Roosevelt in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. It obviously isn't my primary focus, but I think that's an area that could be book number 2. I mean, their relationship and how one brother can become president of the United States, and the other brother, who is the father of of Eleanor Roosevelt, can be dead by age 34. It's tragic and fascinating to consider what must have happened to two individuals who were basically raised exactly the same, with the same privileges and opportunities.
So one question here, there's a lot of great questions, and already we're getting close to the end. So let's say 2 more. Here's a great one. Did Teddy love adventure more than the women? What do you think about that?
Well, there's this phrase that I use in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt, that in Teddy's day, if men had a crisis of confidence or emotion, they prescribed the West cure. Go west, young man. Go hunting. Go find yourself in the mountains and the woods. If women had the same sort of emotional moment, it was the rest cure. Take to the bed and rest. And, I think I contend, I was talking with one of the descendants of the Roosevelts who said, when the going gets tough, the tough go hunting. And they didn't mean it in a complimentary way. And it's a phrase that I repeat in The Loves of Theodore Roosevelt. I think that for all of his extraordinary ability to will through physical pain, the loss of his wife and his mother and his father 6 years earlier really made Theodore both aware of life's preciousness. He didn't have a death wish. He had a life wish, but he also knew that life was precarious and not of your own devising. And so I think, when he could charge up San Juan Hill, he could get shot and continue a speech for an hour. But if it was emotional pain, he had a harder time dealing with it and preferred to have adventure over a hard conversation about how he was actually feeling. And I think that dates back to those events of February 14th, 1884.
whatever openness he might have had closed down a little, because that is one of the questions here of, what a thing to have your devoted mother and your wife die. Did that really change him, or did it just deepen who he already was?
I think he was almost reborn as the person he had imagined he could possibly be, but never had the opportunity to discover. I mean, his time out here in the West, it's a formative period. He used nature as his classroom and teacher, and he, for the first time in his life, had to discover what it was like to work on the equal end of a saw. He's not a Horatio Alger story. This is not, this is not rags to riches. He had every opportunity. And again, that contrast with Eliot, more, men of the era, particularly wealthy men of the era, their story is more like Eliot's than Theodore's. But Theodore had this incredible tragedy that forced him to really rediscover himself and push himself to become a new and different person. And I do think, the deaths of his wife and mother, his time in the Badlands, he said, I never would have been president except for my experiences in North Dakota. He meant it. It wasn't a political statement. The nature, the Badlands, they saved his life. And it was really the fulcrum of the hero's journey.
And in that sense, perhaps Eliot was affected differently by that same tragic curse on the house.
Right.
I was going to. There's so many questions. I guess my last question, because I know we're gonna have you read a little bit in a moment, is how do we explain this extraordinary charm? You do such a beautiful job in this book, laying out such beautiful details, all the components of his character. But there's something greater than the sum of its parts to him. People who don't know much about presidents, who don't know much about TR himself, still love him. Did this give you any insight into why?
Well, I think Theodore Roosevelt is like a Rorschach test. I mean, what you see in him says more about you than it does about him. I mean, Republicans, Independents, Democrats, Josh Hawley and Elizabeth Warren, they cite their favorite president as Theodore Roosevelt. Think of anything else that Josh Hawley and Elizabeth Warren agree on.
Oh, my husband refers to himself as a TR Democrat all the time. People are very confused, except for those who love TR.
Yeah, and I think it's, and it comes from this extraordinary family, that letter from December 31st, 1861. One of the reasons I think it's so remarkable is it proves what we had thought, that he was raised in a house divided, in a nation divided, that his parents disagreed on one of the most contentious issues in American history, the Civil War and slavery, but somehow managed to keep their family intact. They disagreed without being disagreeable. The country came before party and family came before country. And that's a really interesting message. And when you find, as a historian and a writer, when you find evidence of that, we can theorize, we can believe what we think about these historical figures, but there in the Loves of Theodore Roosevelt is a letter that actually says, my goodness, from age 3, he is being infused with this notion of civility and union. That was pretty extraordinary to me.
Well, there's a lesson for all you parents out there. Get your kids memorizing the bases of statues, and greatness is almost inevitable. And stay away from the dangers of demon rum. I guess those are the 2 lessons. So thank you for including me. Thanks for this fabulous book. And thanks to everyone at Negs, that's my mind, that's why I call you, for having me here.
Debbie, thank you. That was a wonderful conversation. And you too as well, Ed. You guys gave us so many insights into a time and a family, into several families, in fact, and we really appreciate it. As we do for all our authors in the American Inspiration Series, we've asked Ed to do a final reading from his book. So over to you for that. I think you're taking us to the Badlands. Is that right?
I am. I'm going to take you to the Badlands. We've talked about Edith, Bammy, and Connie. Remarkably, Edith in the 1890s will say, Theodore, this summer of 1890, I do not wish to be pregnant. I have one request. I insist that you take me back to the place that meant so much to you, to the Elkhorn Ranch, which today is a part of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, the only park named for a person, let alone a president. It's known as the cradle of conservation. And so in the summer of 1890, just to set the scene for this reading, Theodore returns to the Badlands with Bammy, Connie, and Edith. So all three of them are coming to the place that Theodore arrived after the death of Alice. Edith was at first dismayed by the sight of the Badlands town, which she saw at 4 a.m. in a relentless downpour that churned the dry earth into a glutinous slime. Connie wrote, "I had been prepared by many tales for the charm and freedom and informal ease of life in the Badlands, and had often dreamed of going there. But unlike most dreams, this one came true in an even more enchanting fashion than I had dared hope." Connie sets the scene. "We forded the Little Missouri River 23 times on the way to the ranch house, and as the banks of the river were extremely steep, it was always a question as to whether we could go fast enough down one bank to get sufficient impetus to enable us to go through the river and up the very steep bank on the other side, so that either coming or going, we were in imminent danger of doing a complete somersault. Despite the danger, or perhaps because of it, Edith suddenly understood her husband's attraction to North Dakota, this land. She understood it because she too now felt it. Connie also felt an immediate connection to this mysterious place and its almost grotesque landscape. For her, the quote, mingling tints in the sunset sky resulted in a quality of color and atmosphere, the like of which I only remember in Egypt, and made as lasting an impression upon my memory as did the land of the Nile. Despite the presence of her husband, Connie was enchanted by one cowboy in particular. Quote, no one was ever so typically the ideal cowboy of one's wildest fancy as was Sylvain Ferris, she wrote years after her trip to Medora. Tall and slender, with strong fair hair and blue eyes of an almost unnatural clearness, and a splendid broad brow and aquiline nose, Sylvain looked the part. His leather chaps, his broad sombrero hat, his red handkerchief knotted carelessly around his strong, young, sunburned throat, all made him such a picture that one's eye invariably followed him as he rode a vicious pony, wrastled a calf, roped a steer, or branded a heifer. Connie left a lasting impression on the cowboys, too. On the last night at the Elkhorn Ranch, she surprised the camping party by wrastling a calf. With a wordsmith skill often exceeding that of her more renowned brother Theodore, Connie takes us fireside. I can feel now the mud in my boots as I floundered with agonized effort after that energetic animal. I can still sense the strain in every nerve in my body as I finally flung myself across its back, and still, as if it were only yesterday, do I remember the jellied sensation within me, as for some torturing minutes I lay across the heifer's spine before, by a final Herculean effort, I caught that left leg with my right arm. The cries of "Stay with him!" from the fence, the loud clapping of the enthusiastic cowboys, the shrieks of laughter of my brother and my husband, all still ring in my ears. And when the deed was finally accomplished, when the calf, with one terrible lurch, actually wrestled, so to speak, fell over on its head in the mud, all sensation left me, and I remember being lifted up, bruised and encased in an armor of oozing dirt, and being carried triumphantly on the shoulders of the cowboys into the ranch house. The Roosevelt women had proven they could keep pace with the cowboys.
Thank you, Ed. You have painted a wonderful portrait of these women, and of course, of Teddy Roosevelt, and also his remarkable North Dakota, really special. Many thanks to tonight's speakers, Ed O'Keefe and Debby Applegate. Also, thank you to our tech producers behind the scenes, Annie Schreffler, Frederic Rigalot of GBH Forum Network News, and also Hannah, thank you. And to our audience out there in Zoom land, we thank you, Susan and I, and all of us, our speakers as well. We appreciate your interest in America's history in all of its diversity, men, women, stories, good and bad. We hope to see you soon again. And for now, though, a good night to all of you. Thank you for tuning in.